So I've put together for my presentation this morning and my talk. I've actually spent a lot of time putting some slides together as part of what I wanted to share with you as part of my message, and also as a means of also introducing you to to who I am. For some who wouldn't have ever have heard of me before, some of you may know who I am, but I think it's so important, in terms of that introduction of who we are, who we come from. And so with all of my heart, I'm sharing these wonderful people that I come from and have so much pride from as well. So starting with these slides, just to guide us through this conversation, I wanted to just begin by, really speaking in terms of my talk is really about the strength of our people, the spirit of our people, the pride in our people, and as such honoring our people. So for me, that's just a huge part of all of this, and having the speaker series and in my own work, my own life's work. I really, I get to do this in my day job. I work for the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board here in my area. And I've been in that position as First Nation Education Liaison for 21 years. And so I get to, to really speak and go into classrooms from kindergarten to high school to work with teachers and principals, and I really get to do that work where I get to share about our people, where I create that awareness, talk about our history, and bring in those kinds of messages. And so that's one of the things that I do as part of my work. But in everything that I do, in all the various talks I get invited to do, whatever it is, my goal and my life's work is always about honoring our people. So that's something I'm just very blessed to be here this morning to be doing with all of you. So we'll move into the first slide there that introduces these beautiful people that I come from, who helped to shape my life. And when I was born, I was born to a single mom. My mother, lived in home with her parents, which would be my grandparents. And so I had the wonderful, wonderful blessing of being raised in that home. And my grandparents really, they instantly became my mom and dad. I don't think I ever had a day where they actually felt like my grandparents. They automatically became mom, and this is Mom Lucy. And so I'm going to introduce them to you in this way, just really to honor them. So getting to grow up in that home, it was just like having two moms and a dad as those grandparents, just naturally, like I say, they were my parents. So this is Mom Lucy, and Mom was born in Hiawatha First Nation, but she was a beautiful, beautiful woman. And this picture of myself standing beside her there, she's holding my little cousin Suzanne, and that picture is very, very significant to me, and because it was Mom Lucy who really started me off in this life, in rooting me. She rooted me into my identity. So that chair was very significant as well, because that's where Mom and I would sit, and she would tell me stories. She was the one who, shared all the family stories. And she had this incredible scrapbook that she had, put together over the years of all kinds of clippings of people in our community of Alderville. But there was also, clippings from Hiawatha First Nation, Curve Lake First Nation, all in, those that are in our area here. And so for me, as that little wee girl, I would sit and be interested and listening to the stories. She was that first teacher of the language to me, who would teach me some of those language words and phrases. And but most importantly, she took that time to sit there and to really just connect me to my family, and in such a strong way to my identity. And, I always kind of say when I get to speak about mom, it's like mom provided me with this window that I could look through, into the past, into the ancestors, because she painted such clear pictures of those ancestors that were long gone before I was born. But I grew up feeling like I knew them. I grew up just feeling like they were such a part of me. And so for me, those ancestors mean everything. And but mom really laid that foundation, a strong foundation for my life to be built upon. And I only had her until I was 10 years old because she passed away. And so I would never have known, she wouldn't necessarily not have known either, that our time was going to be so short. And yet, when I look back at that, everything that I do today, the work that I do today, that I carry forward, comes from that woman there, that Mom Lucy. And she was my absolute world in that time. And so I just can't speak highly enough to just really acknowledge the importance of that. And so what I do today is I always encourage people as much as I can to listen to those stories, because I was just that little girl, and I'm thankful that I was attentive to, to sit there and really engage and listen to those things and things that were being passed on to me that I have carried throughout the entirety of my life. Because, I'm just turned 59 years old, and you think mom's been gone for 49 of those years. And, so I've lived a long time without her in my life. And yet she just set that path. She, it's like we all sometimes come into this world and we have that life purpose. We know that we are meant to be doing what we're doing. And so my whole life's work, I feel, came from that strong foundation of that time with mom. And so I'm just so blessed. And so I feel like, in terms of sharing with you from a place of resilience and strength, I feel like this is so important for me to share her as part of that story. So I'm thankful for that. So we'll move on. And this is a very important slide to me as well. I feel like this slide here is like part of, those circle teachings, that medicine wheel. And this is really what I see that mom, anchored in me, and what she gifted with me. When we look at that wheel and we see that me, that self, that's each one of us as individuals in that circle of life. And then we see that family that we come from. And family is can be, like for me, that those grandparents that actually were like, for me, that felt like that was my mom and my dad. But family is also, for us as Anishinaabe people, aunties, uncles, cousins are so important, right, in our family. So whatever that is to each one of you, though, that family. Some families have one mom, one dad, two moms, two dads, step parents, whatever it might be, but it's about that self feeling connected to that family. And then there's that community, and I've always been proud of Alderville First Nation as my home. I've lived on the reserve my entire life. I've never lived anywhere else, just here at home on the reserve. And so that's that community then that we're also a part of. And then that nation, is that larger nation around us. So to me, I think of that as that larger, those other Anishinaabe, indigenous nations around us, right? And that we're a part of. And then there's that sense of place and sense of belonging, relationships, our connections. And so for me, I just had that good fortune, that blessing of Mom Lucy, spending that time with me, and just, creating such strong rootedness for me in my identity as part of that self that belongs to all of that. And a sense of place and a sense of belonging is what helps us to thrive. That's what really helps us to thrive, when we know that we matter, when we know we belong, and we have that sense of place. And so that's how I was able to start my life. And even though, through the course of our lives as people, we face a lot of things that come up, and grief and whatever it might be. And so we have to be able to dig deep at times. But for me, that foundation that was created is what's helped me to carry on through my life in good ways. But when I also then, if we look at that wheel and we think about that residential school system, if we think about what happened historically, through the government's policies and their goals of assimilation and all of those things, I'll speak more about as we keep going. But if we think about those children, and when we think that the residential school system went for over 100 years with over 150,000 Indigenous children going through that system, and you think about that self then as, those children being, going off to those schools, what happens to that family? And, like what happens to that community and to all of us as that larger nation of people? And so I think that's just so important for us to just take that in, because we're also a people. We're so strong about the children, and we come from that real philosophy and that strong belief that it takes a whole community to raise a child. Like I was saying, there's aunties, there's uncles, there's cousins, there's the grandparents, there's just so much that we think of that as it takes a whole community to raise a child. So when we think about the trauma and the shock that would have taken place for those children who were taken off to the schools, for those families left behind, families where the children, were taken, were, a family without those children, a community that felt the loss of those children going off to those schools, and then those children's experiences out there on their own in those schools. So I just guess, that sense of place would have completely been taken away, that sense of belonging, and then to recover from that. So, resilience has had to be a part of us as First Nation Indigenous peoples from such young ages, drawing on strength that one would never even imagine they had, and yet drawing on strength as a means to survive, really. So I just really wanted to emphasize, like for myself, in terms of, only getting to have mom until I was 10, and so thankful to this day, every day of my life, that I started out with that strong sense of place and belonging and that identity. So I'm so thankful for that. But I also wanted to liken it back to what has created such strength and resilience among our people when you think about the loss of that through what happened historically to so many. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. And keeping with, sharing with you in terms of who I come from, these are Mom Lucy's parents, so my great-grandparents. So that's Grandpa Fred Simpson and Granny Susan. Now, Fred Simpson was born in Alderville First Nation, and Granny Susan there, she was Susan Muskrat. She was from Hiawatha First Nation, and then they married and had their children, and they lived in Hiawatha for part of that, and then they came over and remained in Alderville. So the reason why I'm sharing this picture of these wonderful people is as part of when I was telling you about Mom, like opening, it's like creating that window for me to look into the past of those ancestors, and especially these being her parents. I literally just like I felt like I knew these wonderful people. And so, Grandpa Fred's just the term I always said, Grandpa Fred and Granny Susan. But I think for me, that's just an example of how strong that connection is for me to them, even though they weren't alive during my lifetime. But Grandpa Fred is a role model, has been a role model all my life, and to many in our community, because he's great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather to so many in our community. And he also was an Olympian. So he represented Team Canada in 1908 in London, England. He raced in Canada and the United States. And when I think about resilience, and I think about what was going on historically, all the various things that government was putting on our people, racism that was going on, I think about, my gosh, I think about Grandpa Fred as that runner. and and going out and living his dream. He was just a natural runner, a long distance runner. The marathon in that Olympics was a 26-mile marathon in London, England, and he placed sixth for Team Canada on that day. And so I guess when I think about wanting to share from coming from strong, resilient people, I see that as such a wonderful example. And these were two of the pillars of our community. We had so many beautiful people that were the pillars of our community throughout our history, and these two are some of them. And and I think about that as that connecting, and how important it was that mom made such an effort to connect me in that way, which is why I think it's important we do that with our young people. Because one of these times, we'll be those people that will no longer be here, but will be somebody that maybe the younger generations will look to as as those people who laid a good foundation for them. When we think 7 generations ahead, and we think about all of that, past, present, and future. So I guess I just wanted to share that as examples again of that resilience from our community here, but also from my own family, and for me as that role model. And Grandpa Fred, I always feel like that message I think that he would give, is that you can do anything that you set your heart and mind to. And that's what I've carried with me throughout my years connected to him. So I just wanted to share that and include them. I see that as really honoring that resilience and beauty that they carried as part of who we are here in Alderville. And next, I want to introduce Dad. So which is my grandfather. So we'll move on to the next slide. So again, this is my own mother's dad. So this is Borden Crow. But again, who became Dad? That was like who became Dad to me. And I'm just so thankful. So Dad, again, he was a chief when I was just a baby and a little girl. That's when he was chief in our community. But it was through Dad that he also contributed to that strong foundation for who I am today. And he raised me, with that belief that I didn't have to do anything that I didn't want to do. And I think, and I chuckle to myself as I think about that, because as a little girl, I think I took great advantage of that at many times when I told him I didn't want to go to school. When I was just in those little, grade 2, 3, 4, whatever, I had many absences as a result in those younger grades, because, I knew Dad always said you didn't have to do anything you didn't want to do. But he is one that connected me to the land. It was Dad that, really connected me to the land, because he was a hunter, a trapper. He was, he used to, in his young life, long before he was a dad to his 10 kids, he was a guide on Rice Lake. Dad was also a musician, among many other things, but that connection to land. So my teachings about that land come strongly through Dad, because he would take me out on the land. I went hunting, in trapping. I knew how to set a trap. I knew how to set snares, and Dad was really proud of that. He was really proud of watching me set a trap and set a snare. And I remember being so amazed at this man who could travel through fields and woods and walk for miles at the pace of a deer. I used to think he was like a deer. And here I was, this young person just having to really do my best to keep up, and he taught me how to walk across, that bush or the woods, with leaves and twigs and everything on ground without making a sound, so I learned a lot, and I heard a lot of stories during that time when we were out on the land, or when we were out on the water. We had a little aluminum boat and motor, and off we'd go for a day of fishing. We would cast for fish, or we would troll. And Dad knew every inch of that lake, that Rice Lake. He knew every island. And so the stories that I received in those years of, the trapping, the fishing, whatever that was, came from that, and connected me strongly to that land. And that's a beautiful thing for me today, as I do the work that I do, when I get to share with young people, with students in schools, and so on, and tell stories. Is the one of the first things that I do is connect them to Mother Earth, remind them about those gifts that come from our Mother the Earth, that gift of water, that gift of air, that life. And that all came from Dad. And so, I'm just so grateful. Dad had a stroke just days before my 16th birthday. And although he did recover over time, he did have a second stroke that confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of the years that he survived that, and it took his speech, and so he could no longer speak. He still remained his sharp self. He still remained determined, and he never lost his wonderful sense of humor or any of those things. But to me, when I think about that grandfather teaching, that bravery, that Ogdain, I think about that as that brave heart. And that's Dad to me. I think of Dad as that, because I think of this man who he walked every day. He would walk, that's part of his routine. He'd get up and then he'd go for that walk to get that exercise right up until, till he had those strokes. And he'd walk whether it was raining, snowing, whatever the temperature. Dad was out there taking that walk. So for me, when he had to be confined like that to a wheelchair, and he'd lost that ability to talk, I just saw him still but still remain that very dignified man, that strong, determined man. And so for me, in my life throughout those years, like he passed away, he did pass away when I was 22 years old. And so again, I draw on strength from that time of being raised by him, by watching that man adapt, to such a life altering time where he lived like that for a number of years, and never, 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 just, he didn't give in to that. He just remained his determined self. And so I see him as that brave heart, as that hero in my mind and in my heart. And I can close my eyes today, and I can remember the smell of the wood stove in the garage where he would do the skinning when we would come back from the trapping, and he would be tending to those animals to prepare those furs, and I would get to be part of doing some of that with him, and I'll just never forget that for as long as I live. And so again, I just honor him and share him with you as part of this talk and this conversation about resilience, because my resilience comes from that Mom Lucy and Dad Borden, and these wonderful ways in which they laid a foundation for me to build my life upon. So I'm just so thankful. So that's a bit about Dad there. And this is my mother. So this is my mother, my generous mother, who was so good at sharing her parents, and being okay with them becoming Mom and Dad to me. And so I'm just very proud of these beautiful pictures as well. And that we got to live in that homestead with Mom and Dad. And as they passed on, we remained there in that home, and for a number of years. And so I'm just proud. My mother is the youngest of 10. She has 2 sisters and 7 brothers she had, and she was the youngest of that group of siblings. And so I'll speak a little bit more about her as we go on. But the picture on the right there, that was ended up being her last powwow, because she did pass away in 2010 at the age of 67. And but again, it's just nice to include her in this conversation as well. So I just want to acknowledge her as well. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this next slide speaks very much to that topic that is a difficult one, but it's such a part of those important conversations that we are bringing forward as that intergenerational trauma and resilience. And so when we think about, so many things that as First Nation peoples, as Indigenous peoples, that have been placed upon us like a separate act, even, that Indian Act, policies of assimilation that were written in a way that were, became known as genocide policies. There are ways to wipe out a people when you attack identity. And that's what that residential school system did, and with the affiliation of the churches as well that took part in all of that, with those residential schools, and also taking the children and as a means of those policies and those goals to achieve that. Their goals of assimilation was the attempts to do that through the children. And there was even the pass system, more so in those prairie provinces, to the Indigenous people of the prairies, where we're not allowed to leave the reserve without a pass, without that signature from the Indian agent. And that I was there's actually a documentary that I don't know whether that came out, but it was done in speaking about how that went on for 60 years in this country. And then the 60s scoop, like this is just a list of things that when we think about trauma and intergenerational trauma, and you look at this list, and this is only part of it, that this list could go on and on throughout our history, throughout those generations, from one generation to the next, in terms of what our people have had to face and carry. And the 60s scoop, and that 60s scoop sometimes is even referred to almost like that extension of what the residential schools were doing, in terms of taking the children. And then when we look at the effects on language, like in terms of speaking about language and including that language, and how beautiful it was prior to our session beginning. Isidore Toulouse and our elder that gave that prayer, Virginia, were speaking in the language with one another, just having a conversation this morning, and it was beautiful to listen to that. And so that language, what we always say about our language, one of the things I always say, and many people say, that language isn't just words put together, like that's really the heart and soul of our people, is that language. Our culture is a part of that language. Our identity is attached to that language. And, and also when I speak about language, I speak about it as, it's like language is like a lens, right? A lens that holds a worldview of how a people think, and the beauty of that language. Like there's like some of those translations, like there's things that don't translate easily, into English, and it's just a whole way of thinking and seeing the world and expressing, right? And so language is key. And so the effects that these various things, like the residential school, forbidding language, punishing children for speaking language, what the effects of that had on language within our communities. And we can look at, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, ongoing water issues, housing, land, and when we think about water, that nebe, water, we can't be here without water. Like we can't be here without that earth. We can't be here without air, those elements that, like that water is life. And yet there are so many communities, First Nation communities, who, have had to live in what are kind of known as third world conditions when it comes to water, and a lack of access to clean running water, and water advisories, those boil water advisories. And you can, and for those of you who are logged on, or who will hear this in the future through a recording, who want to know more about that, you can easily research that on the internet and see a whole list of First Nation communities who've had boil water advisories for 20, 25, 30 years. And like, would that be allowed? Would that be acceptable in a non-Indigenous community? No, I don't believe so. We won't hear about that. And so all of these things, these these issues that we face and have faced throughout generations as Indigenous peoples, again, it becomes so tiring, and yet we have to be resilient, right? That's why this is a wonderful week of conversation, to show that strength, to show that survival, that strength of spirit, to keep on speaking up to those things. And the same with that land, like that historical displacement. Land was a resource right from that time of contact. I think in terms of, why all of these various policies were wanting to, be put in place to be able to, to access that land, as a means of you know, using the land, and here in displacing us, I guess, as Indigenous peoples, create the reserve system being created. I'm very proud of our reserve, and but again, we come from larger territories of land, right? And so those are all issues, so many big issues, again, that, one generation to the next is always speaking to our leaders, our leaders, our chiefs and councils, and those leaders are always speaking to these things. And we can always be thankful for that. And I would be nice to think, will there be a generation where that won't have to be something that is carried, into the future? And then we have those unmarked graves, that have been coming up in the news as of last May, June, July. And I think that brought a lot of a shock to the non-Indigenous public. I think ourselves have always been very aware that, so many children died in those schools. But I think, again, that's why these conversations are important. And in terms of so much trauma, that kind of trauma, when we think about, how things get passed on from one generation to the next, it can't be helped but there to be intergenerational trauma. But again, out of that comes that resilience, like to be here speaking today, to be engaged in this kind of work, and speaking up, and being proud of our people, being proud of such strength, so and I wanted to also just kind of liken that, when I think about the resilience of our ancestors in every generation since throughout time, having to be resilient in the face of such history as these things here on this screen, attempts to strip identity, to take away language and culture. We come from a people whose teachings are so strongly connected to thousands of years of land-based knowledge, to a people who have contributed for thousands of years and shown that strength of spirit and heart, teachings that empower and inspire, and that reflect gratitude, because we're a very grateful people. Our teachings are always filled with gratitude. So to me, I see the resilience of our people reminding me of the resilience of Mother Earth. And, both such good teachers to us, the ancestors and that Ashkakamikwa, that Mother Earth. Because, when we think about that Earth, there's been so much mistreatment to the Earth through pollution, and we're hearing and seeing more in the news all the time of places around the world experiencing floods and droughts and wildfires. And we're hearing more about climate change, that global warming. And yet that Mother Earth continues to be resilient. It doesn't matter. It does matter. She is so resilient, no matter what has been done to her, no matter what damage has been done. She's still life-giving. She still provides for us. And as that blanket of snow, is going to be coming off of that Mother Earth, that spring is going to come, that those flowers are going to bloom. The trees are going to be budding with those leaves, without fail. Grandfather, sun rises every morning without fail. So there's such a strong connection between that resilience of our Earth and the resilience of us as a people. So that's really, when we think about that, what we need to really take that in a big way. Okay, moving on to the next slide, which connects us again to that language. So this is a picture that Dad, Dad, this was the picture that belonged to Dad, because this was his little school picture. Now Dad is in this, he's in the one of the boys there, second in from the right, uh, kneeling down. He's in a little dark jacket, and there's a boy kind of laying on his side in front. Yeah, that's him right there. Thank you, Miigwech. So that's him, and so this was the day school here in Alderville. His sisters are in that picture over there as well, and his brother is just two to the left of him, and so he talked to me about this picture, because he told me that it was during this time when he would speak the language, and that teacher there would chase after him, and he got hit lots at school. And he said that teacher would chase him around and hit him with a stick, for speaking the language. And he said that happened a lot. And then he says, after a while, you don't want to be hit anymore. So you stop speaking the language. Didn't mean he didn't care about the language. It didn't mean he didn't, grow up to end up becoming the chief and being somebody who spoke for our community in many ways. But that's an example. We hear that throughout our history. So many residential school survivors have told their stories, have written books and talks, and so even though this school was right here in our own community, where they went home at the end of the day as that day school, but still dad was affected by that and was hit, and and he talked about that lots to me. And so when we think about that, and we know that there's just so many stories of being punished for speaking the language in schools, in those residential schools, and even in that day school. When we think about, what does that really mean when we think about that punishment for speaking the language? What, and really attacking that language, that's like taking away voice, right? Taking away voice, taking away to be able to speak. And when you think even about those children in those residential schools, whose that first language is that Anishinaabe language or whatever indigenous language it may have been for those children, that was their language and their means of communicating, and being told you're not allowed to speak that. That's like, that's why that attack on language affected identity in such strong ways, right? In terms of that ability to express that attack on identity, on being able to have that voice. And so, what happened too in over the years, I've heard from many of our elders in the community over the years, who, they remembered their grandmother. Oh, they'd say, "Oh, I remember Granny, would say such and such in the language," and but they remembered that their parents and their grandparents stopped speaking the language when they would come in as children. So when I think about Dad, like Mom and Dad, so Lucy and Borden, and so then that didn't get passed on to their 10 kids, really. They did maybe knew some words, but that didn't get passed on. And that's because that, it was so ingrained in those generations that it wasn't okay to speak the language in front of the kids. There was a lot of fear that the kids would be taken away. And there's countless stories within my community of that generation who are now people that are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, who are still here, who share that, who remember that they stopped speaking the language when they'd come in. They would hear them as kids, but they wouldn't speak that with the kids because of that fear. So that there was that real gap in the language being able to be passed on to no fault whatsoever of our own people. So I'll continue on the next slide. This is a powerful statement that language is one of the main instruments for transmitting culture from one generation to another. And that's why that's so important when we think about what the government was doing in terms of that attack on language and identity, is because through that language, is the transference of culture from one generation to another. And so I guess that's, again, but I feel really proud. I think we have to be so proud because our languages are still here. And we do have our communities, where we don't have our fluent speakers. Like one of our last fluent speakers, passed away in 1991. But we have people that, like myself, who have been dedicated and committed to the language. And then in other communities, there are communities who continue to have fluency within their First Nations. But again, we should be proud, no matter what, for that language to be still here, and the resilience that we've needed to keep that going, and to be those ones that continue to carry it forward. And so the next slide is a tribute and an honor to those that shared language with me. So as that young girl, so there's that picture of Mom Lucy again, because she was that first teacher. And I had a love and passion for our language, for anything to do with us as First Nation people, really. But I just loved that language. And I'm not a fluent speaker, but I have a very strong foundation in the language. And then the next teacher that is in the top left corner there, with his hand over his mouth. That's Bill Bigwin. And Bill was from a fluent family here, the Bigwin family in my community of Alderville. And I was a teenager when I was learning from Bill. And when I was old enough to drive, Bill, I used to love going for drives. He'd like me to take him for drives around and stuff. And I was constantly asking him questions about the language and really learning things from him. So I felt like he was my second teacher. And then in the 1980s, we had, the language, two beautiful women from Curve Lake. So the first one to come to our community to teach night classes was Bubbles Knott. She's in the bottom left-hand corner underneath Bill Bigwin there. So she was a language teacher to me, and really, very inspiring teacher. And I was so honored that I got to learn from her. She passed away just a few years ago. And then Ko Buitung, she's in the middle top picture there. That's Ko Buitung. And she came after Bubbles classes were finished. Then Kobe and Murray Wheatung, and Murray's in the middle down there. That they were a beautiful couple who he would drive Kobe over to our community, and she was a language teacher to me as well. And she taught until 1990. Murray became a lifelong mentor of mine, who passed away only a year ago at 100 years old. And he remained a mentor of me with the language all those years. And then when I was at Trent University back in the 90s, late 90s, I guess, mid to late 90s, I took a class with Shirley Williams. She's very, very well known and respected elder. And so she was also a language teacher to me as well. So in this talk of resilience and language and, that beautiful spirit, this is a beautiful slide for me to really honor them, because they're all gone except Shirley is still here. And I'm just so honored that these are the people that I got to learn with and from. And so we'll keep going. So so then in those 1980s to 1990, I was a language learner, but again, from the time I had Mom Lucy, really. And this picture, I've included these next three pictures are very significant, because this was taken in 1990. I'm standing there along with some of these other women. We were standing in support, of course, solidarity with the Oka crisis that was going on in 1990. And as First Nation Indigenous peoples, we do stand together. We do stand in solidarity of one another, whether it's something going on at home in our own home front, or something, across Canada or in another province, whatever is, that there's so much solidarity. And so here in Alderville, we stood in that solidarity. I'm standing in the middle there in the light colored pants and shirt. That's me at the age of 27. But the significance of this also shows that resilience in terms of standing together in solidarity, speaking up, using our voices. But it also, for me, was important as part of this talk to symbolize also that culture and revitalization, because this time period right here, that summer of 1990, started to open a door to culture for us. And as we move to that next slide, we'll see. So our community ended up having our own very peaceful blockade, where we blocked, because our community, our reserve, is situated where we have a highway that runs right through our community, a very main highway. And so so that got blocked, and people could still detour around. It didn't stop people from being able to go from point A to B. They had to take a detour, but we had a peaceful blockade. And as that happened, that also brought to our community people from other, from our other Anishinaabe communities. The big drum came. The big drum came to our community, and right on that Highway 45, where I was standing there with those women in the other picture, they drummed right on the highway there. And my best friend, Marilyn Smoke, from our community as well, we danced for the very first time around the drum. And I was 27 years old, and I remember how powerful that was. And so that time of this blockade, us standing in solidarity, it really started to increase that identity in many ways. And then we had other people come who brought ceremony with them. We had a pipe ceremony. The first time we had a pipe ceremony was in that same time when they came down to visit at that blockade. There was a pipe ceremony in our community. So it was like a resurgence of that identity, of culture opening up to us again, where it hadn't been. And that was powerful. That was a powerful time. And the next slide speaks really strongly to our spirits. If we can move on, our spirits will not be broken. This is a sign that was alongside that blockade. And and I think what better statement for us as First Nation people? Our spirits will not be broken. What an empowering thing for us to take in today, and for those listening here live as we speak, or in future recordings, to know that as Indigenous peoples, like, we do have those strong spirits and that resilience. And so at that time then, because I'd been taking those language classes from those teachers, the chief Nora Bothwell, at the time, she was chief, and she came to visit me in 1991. So a year after this had taken, these pictures were, this was the following year, 1991. She came and she gifted me her eagle feather. And she asked me to be the one to carry on with those night classes, with the language classes. She saw that, I think she saw that passion, that dedication maybe in me, because she gifted me with that eagle feather of hers. And from that moment on, I became that language teacher in my community from the age of 28. And like I say, I just turned 59. So that's like 31 years where, I have done my best every year to offer those classes, to, also support, just as I had been supported by those beautiful language teachers, to encourage, those I've got to teach children, youth, adults, and the elders. And that's how I know those stories, because when those elders were in my language class, and I would, teach them a phrase or whatever it would be, it would remind them that, they totally remembered their grandmother telling them, go run around and play outside. And they would laugh when they would remember. It was like that language was still there. I always would say I was only helping them to relearn, because I think that language is within us, right? It's just such a part of us. So in looking at the time, I better keep going here. There's so much to speak about and to say. So as that culture continued to open up for us, by 1995 in Alderville, we had our very first powwow. So there I am in my jingle dress, and that's my mother. And it was so wonderful for my mother, the youngest of those 10 siblings, as I shared earlier, who didn't get to grow up with that culture, who didn't get to grow up, with any of those teachings, yet she embraced that opportunity and loved dancing at the powwows. And she was faithful dancing, all that time, always dancing. And so she was the only one out of those siblings of hers that did do that. And I think that was something she just was so I'm so thankful I got to watch her be a part of that as well, to reclaim that as part of her right. I think it's our birthright as Indigenous people. It's our birthright to have language. It's our birthright to have that culture. And so that resilience and, in being able to embrace that, and to give thanks to all of those that came before us to keep speaking up for these things and ensuring that we have them to this day. So I'll keep going. The next slide is about my brother. So my brother was born 20 years, there's a 20 years difference between him and I. He's 20 years younger. And so because he was, born in the early 80s, he got to grow up. The language came into the school system at that time in the 80s. Just like the language was being taught in night classes in our community, he was getting to learn the language at school. And so he got to grow up in that stronger identity. He was so proud. And he decided to grow his hair, to grow that beautiful hair. He was 12 years old when that first powwow in 1995 took place. So he was a dancer. And this picture here of him, of course, he's an older teen. And in that picture, he was a wonderful dancer. And then, but when he went off to high school, he endured severe racism. And his high school, for us here, it's only 20 minutes, a 20-minute drive to a town where we all go and shop and all of that. So, he graduated from high school back in the year 2000, but his life was completely altered by his experience in high school because of that racism, because he was that proud Anishinaabe young man. And, so the racism just grew over those years of his high school. And it escalated to one day when a student was in the hallway and with a lighter and was flicking that lighter and, threatening to light his hair on fire, to light that braid. And, spewing, those racist slurs, stereotypical slurs and all of that. And thankfully, a teacher came around the corner at that very time, to stop all of that. But that's what that racism had escalated to. There was other examples throughout his time at school, but given the time I see, I don't have enough time to speak to that all. But I put this quote on that picture: "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." I love that quote because I think that fits my brother. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. He should have been allowed to be, just like generations back, all those children who went through that residential school, everyone who maybe was, taken into the 60s scoop, whatever our stories are across our communities, across our nation, we've all have the privilege of a lifetime of being who we are and should have been allowed to be so. And so my brother, I honor him. I had a conversation with him to get his permission that I could speak to this today. And, he was remembering his own resilience, though, and that he didn't skip school, even as a result. He didn't cut his braid. He did cut his braid after he graduated from school. And I don't know how he managed to go to school every day, given what he faced in the racism at school, but he did. So to me, I see him as another example of that resilience. Although it altered the course of his life for many years, it took him in a different direction in his life from having experienced that. I see that strength in that he did continue to go to school. He was resilient, and he's resilient to this day. And so I wanted to speak to that as a way of honoring him too, and sharing his story, because some others could relate to that. And but being threatened with a lighter, that somebody's going to light your hair on fire, is such a racist act that it's hard to put into words, really. So as we carry on, there's a quote here that speaks so much to that from Murray Sinclair. While Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathens, savages, and pagans and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country. And I think that quote really sums it up, because when I think about what my own brother went through, the things that they said to him, that mindset, like that they could think that they could call him names, and that they go to the degree where they would threaten to light his beautiful braid on fire to threaten that. It comes from that mindset, and it's like it's the same mindset that would allow over 100 years of residential schools to go on, even when that Dr. Peter Bryce was speaking up, and back in that time to speak about the conditions and all of those things going on, it still remained. So I think Murray Sinclair has really summed that up here, that attitude, while that message was being given in those residential schools, that same message was somehow being delivered out in society to for that much racism to carry on for even in my brother's time. So I just think that's really important to share that. And we'll carry on. Time of truth and reconciliation. Those calls to action have been put out now. I think that has been, I think that truth and reconciliation calls to action came out in around 2015. But I wanted this slide to be a teaching slide, for any of those who are logged on today, or again, those future listeners who will maybe hear this in a recording, using that wheel, starting in that place of the yellow where it says watching, being the observers. We can all be the observers for so long, and there's been a lot to observe when it comes to Indigenous life with this history within this country, across Turtle Island. Then we move down to be those listeners. We are those listeners, and that's what everyone taking part here today is. You're being those listeners. But there's a difference, I always say, between the ability to hear and really listening, that intentional listening. So I call upon our non-Indigenous friends and colleagues and those who are wanting to be a part of reconciliation. As you are those observers, as you are those intentional listeners, it takes you then into that place of thinking. How, what do I think about that? How do I feel about that? Then move into what can I do about that? What can I do about that to be one of those people that is, walking toward reconciliation, listening to truth, and because a lot of people will say, like, where are we at in reconciliation? Well, you know what? There's still a lot of truth to be told. There's still a lot of intentional listening to be done, to then take that in, to then think about that, feel that, and then what actions can be done. So I want to, encourage, inspire, empower everyone to go to that place of being a part of that reconciliation. Reconciliation is not, us as Indigenous people. It's that reconciling, having that relationship with one another and being a part of that, and an active participant in that. So I really want to encourage that. And there's only a couple more slides. We'll finish off with, again, just a powerful picture. We've seen this across our lands. Children should not be buried in schoolyards. And as again, that came out in the news, that was a lot to take in. And that is still going to continue. We're going to still continue to hear this. That's not gone away. What seems to have faded is just the attention that it's been getting in the news. And that's something that tends to it's a kind of a pattern that happens for us as Indigenous peoples. It's like something will be brought up in the news, and then it kind of, creates that reaction, but then it kind of always subsides. And that's where we have to have that commitment to reconciliation, to be those active listeners, to really take that in and think, okay, yeah, no, we got to keep this awareness going on. So we're going to hear more about this in the news, and that's where I keep calling on folks. So as we come towards the end, I put that, of course, that what we all are saying now, every child matters, but I want to add that, and always has. And I put it in a circle. I put it in an orange circle because I wanted it to be a reminder that to us as Indigenous people, the children are the center, at the heart of everything. If we think of those children as being in the center of that circle, if that's that circle of life, where we hold those children in the center, surrounded with all of us around it, surrounded with those grandmother and grandfather teachings, that wisdom, that love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, truth, our values, caring, sharing, kindness, all those things. Also a reminder that we are strong, we're resilient and beautiful, that let's keep these conversations going and keep raising that awareness. And but just to remember that every child matters, but always has from the beginning, right? Always has. And so that's what I honor as part of this discussion today, is to honor those of the past, those of the present, and those yet to come, because we are taught to think those 7 generations as well, right? Those 7 generations. So this last slide, or I think there's two more. We have described for you a mountain. We've shown you the path to the top, and we call upon you to do the climbing. What a beautiful way to, start to conclude my talk. Again, from Murray Sinclair, a beautiful quote, because it's a strong quote. It's like we're saying to our non-Indigenous friends and colleagues in public, we've described for you that mountain. We've shown you that path to the top. And now we're calling upon you to do the climbing. That's where that truth and reconciliation, that relationship is so crucial. We call upon you to do that climbing. I'm going to close my talk with this last slide, and I'm going to ask that it just remain on while I read. I took that picture, that sea of orange there. Our chief David Mowat from Alderville First Nation, as Canada Day was approaching in 2021, just this past summer, because of what was going on in the news with those unmarked graves, and there was a lot of discussion about what was going to happen on Canada Day with the flags and all of those various things. So he called upon folks to come and walk. They walked from the community center to our monument and back around again. And there were folks that came from our neighboring non-Indigenous communities as well to join in. And I stood there and I took that picture as they were walking forward. And I know I was taken to tears as a result of seeing that. Again, that solidarity. And then there's that image of my own self there, just in my jingle dress. And I was called, it just, a poem, my writing came from that. So this was on Canada Day, July 1st. And I wrote this poem on July the 3rd, and it's called I Am Moved. And I thought it was a perfect way to conclude my talk. So it says, this is what I've written. I am moved. I am moved by our resilience, moved by strength of spirit and heart, moved by our values of caring, sharing, and kindness. I am moved. Even in the cruel face of a history that wanted to remove us from the land, to displace us, who wanted to wrap us in gifts of blankets full of smallpox, strip us of our identity, wrote policies of genocide that allowed them to take the children, to kill the Indian and the child, and they literally did. I am moved beyond words by our compassion and our generosity. We teach, we share, we welcome. Settlers, they now call themselves, allies. We teach, we share, and we endure. We rise above. We always rise above. I am moved to tears on bended knee, moved by our rootedness, by such deep connection and love for our ancestors from whom we descend, ancestors that paved the way, ancestors that paved the way through blood, through sweat and tears, through loss, through grief, through hardship, through wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. Ancestors who paved the way. They live on within us, within our prayers, within our dances and our songs, in the language, in our stories, in our laughter. They live on because we're still here. We are still here. I am moved by such resilience. I am moved by such beauty, by such grace, by such a state of being, a Mississauga, Anishinaabe, an Ojibwe woman, strong and proud. I am moved by these blessings and gifts that I have inherited, by the blood memory that forever connects me, that carries me forward. I am so deeply moved. Miigwech ahau. And we can stop sharing that and I'm sorry for going over in time, um, but I really appreciated the opportunity to share those stories and to really just encourage and empower uh, you know um, us remaining in that way, that resilience, that strength. And there's those young people coming up behind us are so proud and strong. And so I'm just really, really honored. So I just say Chimigrach for having me today and taking part.
Wow, Chimigwedge, thank you so much, Melody, for sharing. It's so important to have people like you who carry the language and dedicate their life to sharing and teaching. You've touched on a lot of different points today, and I want to say thank you so much for putting together that presentation and sharing your story. I really like what you said about the language and how our language is connected to thousands of years of land-based teachings and teachings in general, and how it is a part of our identity, and each word is a reflection of our spirit and our mind. And the language is so important because each word does have deeper meaning and so many teachings. And that's one of my goals, is to keep learning the language and to keep reclaiming and reconnecting to my culture. And I find it really inspiring to hear your story. I want to open the floor now to anyone who may have a question for Melody. You can comment in the chat system and I will read it. But Melody, I do have a few questions for you here from one of the participants. This one is anonymous. They're asking, what advice would you share with young people who are looking to reconnect with their culture and language?
Oh, that's a really good one. I guess that's just, like if those young ones have someone that they can go to, like, who's in their community, for those who are in a community, or those maybe who are in an urban setting. There are, like sometimes for those who maybe don't have a connection, there's the friendship centers. There are folks to seek out, and within our own communities, where if the young people are, again, it's just reaching out and asking those questions, and in ways of what way can they connect, because our communities are so much wanting to empower and encourage the language or any of the teachings. So there's always something going on, and people that they can reach out to. It's just a matter of finding out who that is for them.
Wonderful. I completely agree. And I know you did touch on how you had a lot of mentors throughout your life, who taught you a lot. And I think that's so important, to build relationships with people in your community, who you can learn from. So that could be one way where we can begin to reconnect to our culture, and also just participate and keep that open mind. There is another question. It is similar to what you had shared. Do you have any tips for those who want to learn the language?
Well, I think in terms of that, like, I think one of the things that I always do, a lot of people are shy. I've encountered lots of people who feel shy about it. Some who feel less than because they're not fluent, and all of that. And one of the things I've always encouraged is to speak any little bit of language that. And that's something that I feel like, if somebody knows a handful of words, or if it's Miigwech or Anin or whatever it might be, my thing, always is to empower them to just use those words, and just, and then again, just seek out where, and nowadays there's a lot online. There's lots of classes, that you can actually take online through Zoom, and so there's lots of ways now. That's even more so. So just keep seeking those out, but don't be shy, to make the effort to speak those words that you may know. And because that's how we learn, and that's also owning that, because it's our birthright. It's everyone's birthright to have that language. And so whether fluent or not, that's your birthright. So you go for it and seek that out.
Absolutely. Definitely getting over the fear of not, speaking confidently in the language. I'm sure when you practice more, the more confident you will be, and being proud of yourself and the journey that you're on in reclaiming and learning the language. I have one more question here. Do you have advice for balancing self-care while we see so many triggering announcements coming from First Nations and residential schools and what's been going on TV recently in the news? What are the advice you can give on self-care and balance?
Yeah, that's another really good question because there is a lot that we're taking in, when we are seeing things on the news and hearing things, or maybe things in our own life with all of that on top of it. Is again just that reminder about taking care of our whole self, that body, mind, spirit, and emotions. And so it is finding that balance. And but ensuring that, because lots of times in terms of taking care of our body, that's getting enough sleep, eating right, making sure we're getting some movement and exercise or whatever that might be. But taking care of our mental health and those emotions is just as important, or finding ways that nurtures our spirit, being grounded through that mother earth. Maybe that's connecting and being outside. It's finding what nurtures that for you. And with those emotions, one of the things that I always like to say is, we become, because sometimes after a while we're kind of conditioned, like, oh, I swallow my tears, I shouldn't cry. We're really taught in those teachings about taking care of that whole self is the importance of those emotions and expressing those things. Like, we would no more go out to our car with two flat tires and off we'd travel, right? We'd go pump those tires up. So it's the same with our emotions and our mental health, or that spirit. We need to find ways that nurtures those things, and finding what works for us. Maybe that's somebody to talk to. Maybe that's writing or art, or going for that walk in nature, whatever that is. But it's recognizing the importance of being balanced, of all that whole self, that body, mind, spirit, and emotions. And again, I think that connecting through that land, through those, being outside, is also really helpful to help ground us, just to take that time and make sure, in this busy world, it's a fast-paced world with everything, with technology and everything, is sometimes is to slow it down and go take that time outdoors even, right? Just to kind of be grounded in that. So that helps us to take better care, and finding those ways that nurture and feed our whole self in a good way.
Wow. Thank you so much for that reminder and how important it is to get onto the land, because when we're on the land, that's when we're grounded and we're in the present moment, and that's when our spirit will tell us and our intuition will tell us what we need to do. So it's so important to take that time for grounding during these times where we do feel, triggered, and having that support system around us. Before we close, does anyone else have any questions? There is a few questions here actually. I see there is a comment from Ellie. We need Anishinaabe immersion programs for everyone. I completely agree. There is another question here. Is it acceptable for non-Indigenous individuals to practice the language as well?
I've had some non-indigenous peoples, taking language before, and who've done that, who have had a connection in some way to, through family or whatever that may be, who've wanted to learn that language.
Okay. I hope that answered your question there. Their name was Shelly. And yeah, if you do have any more questions after, you can send us an email. And there will be a recording provided on a USB drive that Anishinaabe Nation will mail out to each participant who participated in today's session. But I want to thank you all, and this concludes day one of the Resilient Speaker Series. Chimigwech to everyone involved who made this happen, to Melody Crow for sharing space with us this morning, to Engaged Creative Productions for handling all of the technicalities, to Kelsey from Anishinaabeg Nation for coordinating and bringing this series to light, because I know many of our people and youth especially are still suffering to this day. It is important that we talk about this resilience and share amongst the community so that we remember how far we've come, but also that we have the ability to go out and learn and to continue this reclamation of culture. And we will see you tomorrow at day 2 of the Resilient Speaker Series. The theme is reconnecting and strength, and this is facilitated by Carol Hermestein. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Do some self-care, and have a wonderful evening. We'll see you next time. Bamapi, everybody.